The B-1 Lancer. A machine built to end the world. 4 afterburners. 120,000 pounds of thrust. When it tears through a valley at Mach 1.2, low enough to count the 3 bomb bays under its belly. Car windows rattle within a mile. So how did a monster like this become the strangest, most paradoxical war machine in American history? 70,000 feet. That's the altitude at which Americans believed no missile could ever reach them. On the 1st of May 1960, a Soviet SAM proved them wrong by shooting down Gary Powers' U-2 at exactly that altitude. The entire United States bomber fleet was relying on that altitude to survive. After that day, the high-altitude doctrine collapsed. An entire military philosophy had to be rewritten. The only option left was to fly low, hugging the terrain, hiding in the hills, slipping past radar by disappearing between ridgelines. But what bomber could do that? The B-52 was too big and too slow. The F-111 was fast, but too small to carry strategic nuclear weapons. The Air Force needed something entirely new. In 1963, the Advanced Manned Strategic Aircraft program was launched. It dragged on for so long that pilots began mocking it as America's most studied aircraft. It wasn't until 1970, after 7 years of delays, that Rockwell finally won the contract. They gave their bomber a name, the B-1A. 4 years later, on the 26th of October, 1974, 10,000 people packed into Palmdale, California to watch the first prototype rolled out of the hangar. A massive machine painted bright white, as long as a 6-story building laid on its side, its wings spread wide and proud. 2 months later, 3 men climbed into the cockpit. Bach, Sturmthal, Abrams. They pushed the throttles forward. 4 F-101 engines roared together. The B-1A lifted off and flew for 78 minutes without a single problem. It was one of the few easy days the B-1A would ever have. The B-1A wasn't like any bomber that had come before it. 150 feet long, with a wingspan of 137 feet fully extended, wider than a Boeing 737. Maximum takeoff weight, 400,000 pounds, heavier than a freight train. 4 General Electric F-101 engines were mounted in pairs beneath the fuselage. Each one produced more than 30,000 pounds of thrust in the afterburner. When all 4 lit at once, the combined thrust was enough to push that 400,000-pound machine past the speed of sound in minutes. But what made the B-1A truly different was its wings. For takeoff, or low-speed flight, the wings stretched fully forward to generate maximum lift. For high-speed flight, they swept back to 67.5 degrees, transforming the B-1A into an arrowhead. The whole process was controlled by 2 hydraulic actuators inside the fuselage, each capable of producing well over a ton of force. Beneath the belly were 3 massive bomb bays. Each one could carry 8 B-61 nuclear weapons, or 24 short-range attack missiles. In total, the B-1A could haul over 75,000 pounds of weapons, twice what an early B-52 could carry. The crew was 4. 2 pilots up front, 2 systems officers behind, 1 for offense, 1 for defense. All 4 sat inside a single escape capsule that could separate from the aircraft in an emergency. The cockpit had 9 aluminum blast shields that could be deployed in just 5 minutes because the B-1A was going to fly into a nuclear war where a single bomb detonating miles away could blind the crew for life. The windows themselves were coated with a special ceramic layer that turned opaque in 150 microseconds the moment sensors detected a nuclear flash. A month after the first flight, Bach swept the wings for the first time in midair. As they angled back to 67.5 degrees, the B-1A became an arrowhead in the sky. It was built for one purpose: penetrate the Soviet Union at low altitude, deliver nuclear weapons, and come home. But flying close to the ground at high speed was no easy task. The air was thick. Gusts were brutal. One B-1 pilot later described the experience this way: It felt like a roller coaster. One moment you'd be weightless, the next, your breakfast was trying to come up. Rockwell solved the problem by adding 2 small vanes near the nose. They looked like a pair of cat whiskers, automatically dampening the vibration as the B-1A tore through valleys. Without them, pilots were exhausted in under 30 minutes. The pilots loved this machine. They gave it a nickname, the Bone, a play on B-1. Said quickly, it sounded like bone. By October 1978, B-1A No. 2 lifted off from Edwards Air Force Base on a maximum speed test. The pilot pushed the throttles all the way forward. All 4 afterburners lit. The needle climbed past Mach 2, then Mach 2.1, then Mach 2.2, Mach 2.22. It was the fastest any B-1, in any variant, would ever fly. A record no one would ever break. And 6 years later, that very same aircraft would never come home. But every record set in the air came with a price down on the ground. And the price of the B-1A was rising faster than anyone had expected. In 1970, each B-1A was projected to cost $40 million. By 1977, that number had nearly hit $100 million, more expensive than any aircraft Congress had ever approved. At Edwards, the pilots kept pushing the machine past new limits every single day. They had no idea that in Washington, a man was staring at the B-1A's price tag and shaking his head. His name was Jimmy Carter. Carter had made the B-1A the centerpiece of his 1976 campaign. On stages all across America, he called it a weapon that wastes taxpayer dollars. Voters listened and voted him in. When Carter walked into the White House in January 1977, 3 classified intelligence reports were waiting on his desk. The first came from a Soviet lieutenant named Viktor Belenko. In September 1976, Belenko had defected to Japan in a MiG-25, the Soviet Union's most closely guarded aircraft. Over 5 months of debriefings with the CIA, he revealed something stunning. The Soviets were developing a new kind of radar, one that could look down at the ground and shoot down low-flying aircraft. The first bullet had hit the B-1A in the heart. Because the entire philosophy of the B-1A was built on flying low beneath enemy radar. If Soviet radar could now look down, the B-1A wasn't a stealth bomber anymore. It was just a very large target. The second report came from the Pentagon itself. A new weapon, the AGM-86 cruise missile, was small, cheap, and could be launched from an aging B, 52 hundredths of miles from its target. No expensive bomber needed to fly into enemy airspace at all. A French general put it bluntly, for the price of one B-1, you can buy 200 cruise missiles. The third report was top secret. At Lockheed, engineers had already built a prototype of something that had never existed before, a bomber that radar couldn't see. Stealth, Carter knew, but he couldn't say a word. He had his decision. On the 30th of June 1977, Carter walked out to face the press at the White House. He called the B-1A a very expensive weapon that is no longer needed. The program was killed on the spot. 4 prototypes would be all that ever existed. At Edwards, the test pilots heard the news over the radio as they were preparing for an afternoon flight. Their aircraft had just been killed. Across America, B-1 supporters erupted. The loudest was Congressman Robert Dornan of California, a man so obsessed with the bomber that the press had nicknamed him B-1 Bob. Standing before the cameras just after Carter's announcement, he shouted, "They're popping vodka and caviar in Moscow tonight." But in Moscow, no one was popping anything. Declassified documents from decades later revealed a strange irony. The Soviets weren't actually afraid of the B-1. They were terrified of the ALCM cruise missile the Pentagon had just developed. Carter knew that. He also knew about the stealth bomber locked away at Lockheed, but he couldn't say a word in public. And so, Carter became the president who killed a supersonic bomber for reasons the American public would never be told. The B-1A was dead on paper, but at Edwards, it kept flying. Congress demanded the 4 prototypes be kept airborne for continued testing. So every week, the pilots kept climbing into the cockpit, kept lighting the afterburners, kept pushing the throttles forward. Even a year after the cancellation, that same B-1A No. 2 set the Mach 2.22 record we just witnessed. The machine didn't know it was dead. It just kept flying faster than ever before. But in Sacramento, California, a former Hollywood actor was watching everything. He was the state's governor now, and Ronald Reagan was preparing to run for president. 4 years after being killed, the B-1A came back to life. The man who brought it back was Ronald Reagan. During the 1980 campaign, he had promised to revive the B-1, and once elected, he kept his word. The new version was called the B-1B, slower than the B-1A, but coated in materials that made it nearly invisible to Soviet radar. Reagan ordered 100 of them and demanded production begin immediately. Before mass production, the Pentagon needed a prototype to test the new flight control systems. There was one sitting in a hangar in the California desert, gathering dust after years of silence. The same one that had hit Mach 2.22 a few years earlier, a record no later variant would ever touch. B-1. A number 2. It was pulled out of storage, refurbished, fitted with the new B-1B flight controls, and put back in the air. Test pilots flew it through dozens of sorties. No problems. Until the last flight. The Mojave Desert was still that morning. The sky was clear. The chief pilot was Doug Benefield, Rockwell's chief test pilot. 11,000 hours, flying various B-1 variants. He was also the same man who had taken B-1A number 2 up on its very first flight years before. No one knew this aircraft better than he did. With him in the cockpit were Air Force Major Richard Reynolds and Captain Otto Wanacek. The test was supposed to be simple. As the wings swept forward, Benefield needed to transfer fuel from the rear tanks to the forward tanks to keep its center of gravity in balance. A procedure he'd done hundreds of times. A procedure he could have done in his sleep. That day, he forgot. The center of gravity stayed too far aft. As it slowed, the nose of the B-1A pitched upward. The wings stalled. It lost control. A chase plane flying alongside to monitor the flight came on the radio. "Doug, you okay?" Benefield answered. These were his last recorded words. "We may have to abandon." "We have to abandon, gentlemen." Reynolds pulled the ejection handle. The escape capsule separated from the falling aircraft just 9 seconds before it hit the desert floor. The parachute system fired properly. But one of the explosive bolts misfired, and the parachute lines didn't deploy correctly. The capsule came down on its side, nearly vertical. Reynolds and Wanacek survived, badly injured. Benefield died on impact. The B-1, A number 2, burned out on the desert floor, the same desert where, 6 years earlier, it had flown faster than any B-1 in history. 40 miles south of Edwards at the Palmdale plant, the B-1B assembly line was still running. The news of Benefield's death arrived that afternoon. The engineers stopped working. They stood around the cockpit blueprints, silent. The man who had taken B-1A number 2 up on its first flight, who had flown it for a decade, had just been killed by the very escape system they had designed. The decision was made overnight. The common escape capsule would be eliminated. Every B-1B pilot from now on would have an individual ejection seat, a simpler design, a more reliable design, paid for with one man's life. The lesson of Benefield's death was built into every B-1B that rolled off the line afterward. By 1988, all 100 had been delivered to the United States Air Force, each one carrying a design that had been paid for in blood. The B-1B was ready for the war it was built to fight. The trouble was that war would never come. On the 25th of December 1991, the hammer and sickle flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. The enemy, the B-1B had been built to fight, had simply vanished without a single shot, without a single bomb. At Dyess and Ellsworth, 100 B-1Bs sat idle. The pilots were still there, the aircraft were still there, but the purpose was gone. In 1994, under an arms reduction treaty with Russia, the B-1B was stripped of all nuclear capability. The wiring was cut. Nuclear control systems were permanently removed. And so, the secret the B-1B had carried for 40 years was finally revealed. It never dropped a single nuclear weapon. Not once. The machine designed to flatten Moscow never did the one thing it had been built to do. Instead, it found a new purpose. Of every bomber in the American fleet, none could carry more weapons than the B-1B. 75,000 pounds in a single sortie, more than the B-52, more than the billion-dollar B-2. Its bomb bays could carry just about anything from dumb bombs to cruise missiles. A single B-1 B could destroy a power plant, an ammunition depot, and a port in one mission. 6,000 miles unrefueled. With aerial refueling, more than 30 hours non-stop. Over Afghanistan and Iraq, B-1B crews would loiter for hours above the battlefield, waiting for ground troops to call in targets. In the first 6 months of the Afghanistan campaign, just 8 B-1Bs dropped nearly 40% of all the ordnance the entire Air Force delivered. A machine born to start World War III had become the workhorse of small wars. But time spares nothing. Every flight hour required almost 50 hours of maintenance. By 2021, the Air Force dragged 17 B-1Bs to the boneyard in the Arizona desert. At Davis-Monthan, thousands of retired aircraft sit under the desert sun, wings wrapped in white tarps, cockpits sealed. 17 B-1Bs joined the line. Among them, one named Rage. Everyone thought that was the end. They were wrong. By early 2026, the Middle East was on fire. The Pentagon needed bombers immediately. The B-21 Raider wasn't ready yet, and someone remembered the boneyard. In March, B-1Bs from Ellsworth flew 30 hours non-stop, halfway around the world, and struck Iran. Operation Epic Fury. 2 months later, Rage lifted off again. 200 mechanics had replaced more than 500 parts. When it landed at Dyess, it carried a new name, Apocalypse 2. A machine designed in the 1970s to fight the Soviet Union was now carrying hypersonic missiles over the Middle East. The B-21 will replace it before 2037. But until then, the bone keeps flying. This is the legacy of the B-1 Lancer. Not the Mach 2.22 record it once set. Not the nuclear weapon it never dropped. Not the world it was built to end. But its refusal to die.